Hey guys, tonight we're leaving the shore behind. The year is 1670. The world is still being mapped, and the ocean is the one place big enough to hold every dream, every rumour, every danger. Imagine the air heavy with salt and tar, the faint glow of harbour lamps, the groan of anchors, the shouts of sailors calling out to one another as they prepare to sail into the unknown. The 17th century was an age of empires and hunger. England, Spain, France, and the Dutch all fought for trade routes, silver and sugar. Behind every royal decree stood thousands of poor men and boys whose only real wealth was courage. For them, the sea was not romance, it was employment. And yet, something about the endless horizon felt like promise, even if that promise was wrapped in danger. Ports like Bristol, Port Royal, Havana, and Nassau were alive with noise and temptation. Recruiters walked the wharves, spinning stories for anyone desperate enough to listen. Good pay, they said, adventure, food. What they didn't mention were the whips, the hunger, the sickness that came from months at sea. But to a young man with no coin and no hope on land, the risks sounded worth it. To sign a ship's articles was to trade certainty for possibility. The first voyage was always the hardest. A new sailor learned quickly that the sea never slept. The deck rolled underfoot, ropes creaked, and every gust of wind sounded like a warning. Below deck, men swung in hammocks, dreaming of dry ground and full bellies. The air smelled of wood, sweat, and salt. Days blurred into nights, nights into weeks. Hunger, storms, and the lash taught lessons faster than any schoolmaster could. And yet, amid the hardship, a strange beauty revealed itself. There were mornings when the world turned silver, when the sun rose out of the water like a coin freshly minted by God. The same sailor who had cursed his luck at midnight might feel, for a fleeting moment, that he was part of something vast and eternal. Freedom was not a word yet. It was a feeling, the quiet rush of wind in the sails and the taste of salt on the tongue. In the taverns of the New World, stories were a kind of currency. Men who had returned from distant voyages told of islands rich with gold, of hidden coves where silver washed ashore with the tide, of captains who ruled like kings and feared no empire. Most listeners knew these were lies, but lies were more nourishing than bread. After a few mugs of rum, even the most sceptical sailor began to believe that fortune waited just beyond the next horizon. Some dreamed of wealth, others simply wanted a life without masters. The line between poverty and rebellion was thinner than a rope stretched across a mast, and when that rope finally snapped, piracy was born. It did not begin as villainy, it began as survival. When sailors found themselves unpaid, beaten and discarded, they looked at their captains and thought, why not us? Why not take the ship, take the cargo, and live by our own code? At dawn, when the sea was calm, a young sailor could climb the rigging and see nothing but blue in every direction. No land, no law, no king, only possibility. In that vastness, a strange idea began to grow, that a man might belong to no one but himself, that he might choose his captain, vote on his fate, share what he earned. A small, fragile dream, carried on the wind long before it had a flag. He did not yet know of battle or gold or the gallows. He knew only that the world was wide and that the sea would take him anywhere his courage could reach. Every wave whispered the same invitation. Come find what the land has denied you. So the story of the pirate begins not with greed or blood, but with yearning. Yearning for bread, for freedom, for a name that meant something beyond a pay slip and a grave. And that yearning, carried by wind and rumour, would soon darken into legend. As you let your thoughts drift tonight, imagine that boy on the deck, his eyes fixed on the horizon, the wind filling his hair, the world spread out before him. Wild, dangerous and new. He does not know that within a few short years he will trade the colours of his king for the black flag. He only knows that he is alive, and that for the first time the world feels infinite. Next time we'll follow him into the years before the black flag, into hunger, war, and the choices that made ordinary sailors into outlaws. Mutiny spread quietly from ship to ship like an infection the captains could not cure. The pattern was always the same: hunger, injustice, the whip, and at last the whisper. A crew could endure almost anything except endless unfairness. When they saw their captain dine on salted pork while they chewed mouldy bread, or when their promised wages vanished into a ledger's false ink, the balance between obedience and rage tilted beyond repair. The moment came without warning. Sometimes it happened in the heat of a calm noon when the sails hung lifeless and the air pressed heavy against the skin. Sometimes in a storm when the sea itself seemed to join the rebellion. The boatswain turned, the helmsman hesitated, and suddenly the deck belonged to the crew. Officers were thrown into the sea or set adrift in longboats. The ship, once bound by royal decree, now drifted under no flag at all. These new captains were rarely tyrants. Many had suffered the same punishments they now condemned. They understood that a happy crew fought better than a starving one. So they wrote their own laws, not with ink, but with promises shouted across the deck. Equal shares of plunder, voting on destinations, no striking a man in anger, compensation for the wounded, and the most radical of all, the right to choose and remove a captain by common vote. It was rough democracy born on rough water. For the first time, men who had never owned so much as a pair of shoes now held power over their own lives. The transformation was intoxicating. They had turned the king's ship into a republic that floated wherever the wind carried it. The world ashore had no name for this kind of freedom. To the merchants and admirals it looked like madness. They called it mutiny, banditry, treason. But to the men who lived it, it felt like justice long overdue. From the African coast to the Caribbean, mutinous crews began to meet in hidden coves. They traded stories and rum, patched sails, compared rules, and gave themselves a new identity. They were sailors still, but no longer servants. They were free men of the sea, and soon their gatherings would form the first true pirate brotherhoods. Some of the earliest lived on the edge of legality. In the 1660s and 1670s, French adventurers called flibustiers settled on the island of Hispaniola and the nearby islet of Tortuga. They hunted wild cattle and pigs, smoked the meat to sell to passing ships, and drifted easily between trader, privateer, and outlaw. The English called them buccaneers after the wooden frames. Boucans they used for curing meat. The name stuck. The buccaneers of the Caribbean would soon be feared by every empire that claimed to rule those waters. They lived by few rules, but the ones they had were sacred. Before a voyage, each crew drew up an agreement called the Articles. It listed every man's share of the profits and the punishments for betrayal. It promised care for the injured. A hand lost in battle earned a set amount of silver, a leg more. If the captain failed in courage or cheated the crew, he could be deposed by vote. In a world where kings ruled by birth, these were astonishing ideas. The ships themselves were small but fast. Brigs, sloops, and schooners built for speed, not cargo. They carried as many guns as they could steal and were manned by crews twice the size of any merchant vessel. Every man knew the sails, the ropes, and the guns. A pirate ship was not graceful, but it was alive, humming with the rough energy of equality. At sea, discipline changed its face. The cat-o'-nine-tails was gone. Humour and loyalty replaced fear. Orders were argued before they were obeyed, and laughter often drowned the thunder of the waves. They shared everything: food, rum, danger, and profit. The quartermaster kept the keys to the hold and balanced the captain's authority. In battle the captain commanded, in peace the crew ruled. Rum was both comfort and currency. It erased hierarchy faster than any law could. Around a shared barrel every man's story mattered. They drank to the dead, to luck, to the hope of one more sunrise. They carved small tokens from bone or shell, charms for protection, tied them to the rigging. The sea took many things, but it never took their humour. Not every mutineer chose piracy. Some turned back, surrendered, or sought pardon. But those who stayed learned to navigate without charts, to find hidden harbours where imperial patrols dared not follow. They painted their ships in dark colours and gave them names that mocked authority: liberty, revenge, defiance, fortune. Each name was a declaration. For a few brief years these floating communities flourished. They raided the Spanish Main, took prizes from rich merchantmen, and traded in secret with settlers who were glad to buy their stolen goods at half price. In the taverns of Port Royal, coins stamped with distant monarchs clinked together in a single chaotic pile. Gold was gold. No one asked its origin. The empires called them criminals. The common people called them legends. Ballads were sung about their daring and their cruelty, their laughter in the face of the gallows, their refusal to kneel before any flag but their own. The truth was simpler. They were sailors who had been pushed too far and had found, in rebellion, a strange kind of peace. As the century moved toward its end, the number of such ships multiplied. Some were born from mutiny, others from the ashes of war. When peace treaties left thousands of privateers unemployed, they kept their weapons and their habits. The line that had once separated the king's men from the king's enemies vanished altogether. By the time the new century dawned, the Caribbean had become a chessboard of ambition. Merchants, navies, and freebooters all chasing the same golden dream. The ports were rich, the sea lanes crowded, and the opportunities endless. Out of this chaos rose the era the world would later call the Golden Age of piracy. By the turn of the 18th century, the Caribbean was no longer a frontier. It was a map of greed. Every island carried the flag of a different empire, and every empire wanted more. Between them ran the trade winds, steady, warm, and thick with the scent of sugar. and along those winds drifted ships laden with gold, indigo, tobacco, and enslaved human lives. The sea was the single road that connected the wealth of the New World to the hunger of the Old, and along that road, piracy found its perfect home. The buccaneers who had begun as hunters and smugglers evolved into something bolder. They learned the timing of convoys, the habits of governors, the weaknesses of merchant captains. In hidden coves they repaired their hulls and shared intelligence drawn from gossip, spies, and drunken boasts overheard in taverns. Every rumour was a potential fortune. One Spanish galleon might carry enough silver to buy a kingdom. One stroke of luck could turn a starving sailor into a legend. The new century brought new tools. Navigation improved. Small, fast ships could now cross entire oceans without hugging the coast. Muskets grew lighter, cannon more reliable, and charts more precise. The very inventions that made empire possible also made rebellion harder to catch. A pirate armed with speed and knowledge could outsail any lumbering treasure ship. The sea no longer belonged solely to the crowns of Europe. It belonged to those quick enough to seize it. Across the Atlantic, London and Paris called it commerce. On the decks of Port Royal, Nassau and Tortuga, it looked like chaos. Port Royal, Jamaica, was known as the richest and wickedest city on earth. Merchants, privateers, and pirates mingled in its narrow streets, drinking in low taverns where the floorboards were slick with rum and seawater. Gold changed hands so quickly that men measured wealth not by what they owned, but by how much they could waste in a night. Prostitutes, gamblers, and thieves lived beside preachers who prayed for their souls while renting rooms to them. It was a city built on contradiction, law and lawlessness, piety and greed, survival and pleasure. Then, in 1692, the earth itself rebelled. A massive earthquake struck Jamaica, swallowing 2/3 of Port Royal beneath the sea. Hundreds died in minutes, and the survivors told stories of churches collapsing and streets vanishing under boiling waves. To the faithful, it was divine punishment. To the sailors who escaped, it was a sign that nothing built on corruption could last. They scattered to other islands, carrying with them the habits of Port Royal. The trade in plunder, the defiance of kings, the thirst for freedom. In the years that followed, piracy became a profession. Former privateers out of work after the great European wars turned to it in droves. They already had ships, cannon, and crews trained for violence. All they needed was nerve. They spread across the Caribbean like sparks on the wind. Some preyed on Spanish shipping along the Main. Others haunted the routes between the colonies and Europe. The sea was wide enough for everyone. Tortuga, once a refuge for hunters, became the first true pirate haven. There a man could sell stolen goods, recruit crew, and refit his ship without questions. The island was small, rocky and wild, but its harbour was deep and its people restless. French, English, Dutch, and African sailors mingled under makeshift banners, united by profit and rebellion. Governors looked the other way as long as the rum flowed and a share of the loot arrived on their desks. In Tortuga's taverns, men drew their own maps of empire, ones where no king's name appeared. Further east, the Bahamian island of New Providence offered a safer anchorage. Its main town, Nassau, had once been a proper colonial outpost but had fallen into neglect. The fort was crumbling, the garrison gone, and the harbour perfect for hiding ships. By 1715 it had become the unofficial capital of the pirates. There were no taxes, no governors, no sermons, only opportunity. Ships from every corner of the Atlantic gathered there to trade, repair, and celebrate. The taverns overflowed with music and stories. Deals were struck over mugs of grog, and for the first time the scattered outlaws of the sea began to think of themselves as a nation. They called it, half in jest, the Republic of Pirates. It had no written constitution, but it had customs everyone respected. Captains were chosen by vote. Shares of plunder were distributed according to clear rules. Decisions were made in open council. Discipline was strict but fair. A thief who stole from a crewmate lost an ear or worse, but a wounded man received care and payment. Every colour of skin, every faith and language could find a place if he worked hard and fought bravely. Freedom was the only passport. Among them rose names that would echo long after the last mast rotted. Henry Jennings, Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the man who would become legend, Edward Teach, known to history as Blackbeard. Each commanded ships with crews who lived by shared risk and shared reward. When they captured a prize, the treasure was tallied in the open. The captain received 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, gunners and carpenters 1.25, everyone else 1. Even those who lost limbs had a claim. Justice was rough, but real. In this strange democracy, the lowest sailor could speak as loudly as the highest officer. Many of them had fled the brutality of naval life. They swore never to repeat it. On these decks, power came not from birth or royal favour, but from courage, luck, and respect. When a captain grew reckless or cruel, the men simply replaced him. The world on land might sneer at such equality, but on the sea it worked. A ship ruled by consent sailed better than one ruled by fear. Pirate life was still harsh. Food spoiled quickly, storms ripped sails, disease travelled faster than rumour. But there was laughter too, and songs that rose into the night. They sang about home, about the next raid, about the wide open sea. Rum and camaraderie dulled the edge of danger. For a moment in history, brief, impossible, and golden, the poorest of men lived as freely as kings. The empires took notice. Governors petitioned for warships, merchants begged for protection, and fleets were sent to scourge the seas. Yet the pirates thrived because the oceans were too vast and the navies too few. A single sloop could vanish behind an island or melt into a storm, only to appear weeks later 100 miles away flying fresh colours and a new name. Every captured merchantman, every seized cargo was a message to the world that the authority of kings ended where the horizon began. By 1717, Nassau reached its peak. More than 2,000 outlaws called it home. The harbour glittered with stolen ships, their hulls patched and their cannons gleaming. Traders came openly to buy their goods. Tavern owners grew rich serving rum by the barrel. It was a paradise built on theft but sustained by fellowship. For a fleeting decade the Caribbean belonged to nobody and to everyone at once. It was an experiment in freedom born from desperation, and for those who lived it, it felt eternal. But nothing on the sea lasts forever. In the distance, new sails were gathering, ships bearing royal seals, warships sent to reclaim order. The golden years were almost over, though the men who lived them did not yet know it. Tonight they celebrated under the stars, unaware that the tide was already turning. Morning came slowly on a pirate ship. There was no bell from a church tower, no rooster's cry, only the sound of the waves against the hull and the creak of ropes in the wind. The light filtered through torn sails and broken shutters until it reached the cramped space below deck where the crew slept. Men woke stiff from the hammocks, their backs damp with sweat, their throats dry from last night's rum. They stretched, cursed softly, and began the same ritual that had carried them through 100 dawns. The air below deck was thick and close. The smell of tar, salt, and unwashed bodies never left. But there was laughter even here. Someone always managed a joke, a curse in 3 languages, or a song half remembered from home. A bucket of seawater passed down the line served as bath and wake-up both. Bread hard as wood and salted meat were breakfast, washed down with watered rum called grog. It was enough to keep a man alive, if not happy. Above them, the deck came alive. The helmsman gripped the wheel, eyes scanning the horizon for sails or storms. The lookout climbed to the crow's nest, a small platform swaying far above the deck. From there he could see for miles, blue on blue, the world repeating itself in every direction. The boatswain barked orders. Men hauled ropes and adjusted sails. Every movement had rhythm. The ship was not a collection of wood and iron, but a living body, and the crew its beating heart. There was work for everyone. The gunners cleaned and greased the cannons, making sure the powder stayed dry. Carpenters patched leaks and hammered new planks where the sea had bitten too deep. The cook boiled whatever could be spared in a single black pot. Beans, rice, maybe a scrap of pork. The smell drifted through the ship, thin but comforting. Even on a vessel ruled by chaos, there was a strange order in the routine. The sea demanded it. Afternoons were slower. The sun beat down like a punishment, and the deck grew so hot that men wrapped rags around their feet. Those off-duty slept in the shade of the sails or sat along the rail, mending clothes, cleaning pistols, or carving small charms from bone. Some played dice or cards for bits of tobacco. Others leaned over the side, staring at the water, lost in thought. The ocean could hypnotize even the toughest man. Endless, glittering, always moving. Discipline among pirates was different from the Navy's cruelty. They kept order by respect rather than fear. A quarrel over a game or a stolen ration was settled before witnesses, and the quartermaster acted as judge. The punishments were simple: loss of pay, confinement in the hold, or for serious crimes, marooning on a deserted island with a bottle of water and a pisto. Death was rare. The sea itself was punishment enough. Evening was the ship's favourite hour. The work ended, the wind cooled and rum passed freely. Someone brought out a fiddle or a drum, and the music began. The songs were old, some from Africa, some from Ireland, some from nowhere anyone remembered. Voices rose into the dusk, rough and tuneless but full of life. They sang about home, about the next raid, about women, storms, and freedom. The stars appeared one by one, scattered across the sky like coins spilled from a chest. The men lay back on the deck, drinking, talking, dreaming. For a little while the world felt safe. At night the ship changed again. Watch was set. 2 men at the helm, 1 in the nest, a few patrolling the deck. The rest slept. The sea around them was black and silent, broken only by the whisper of waves. Sometimes distant lightning flickered far off, turning the horizon white. Sometimes a whale surfaced beside the ship with a sigh so human it made the men cross themselves. In those moments the sea seemed alive, vast and indifferent, a god too old to care. Life on board was not only hardship, it carried its own kind of peace. The men who had once been beaten and robbed now owned their labour. They ate the same food as their captain, shared the same dangers, and took equal shares of the prize. No one bowed, no one begged. Even the youngest hand had a voice in council. Decisions were made by vote, and arguments ended with laughter more often than violence. It was democracy stripped bare, born not from philosophy, but from necessity. When they neared a coast, excitement spread like fever. The smell of land drifted across the water, soil, flowers, smoke from unseen fires. They prepared to anchor, to barter, to find fresh food and repair the ship. Some went ashore for supplies, others for women, rum, and the wild noise of the taverns. For a few nights they lived like kings, spending in hours what had taken months to steal. Then the money ran out, the ship's horn sounded, and they returned to the sea with nothing but memories and headaches. Not every day was peace. Some mornings the lookout's cry split the calm. "Sail ho!" Every man ran to his station, the ship turning toward its prey. They loaded the cannons, checked the pistols, and waited for the captain's word. The moment before battle was electric, fear and joy tangled together. They had chosen this life, and now it demanded its price. But that story belongs to another chapter, for now the sun sinks behind the water. The ship drifts in a soft wind. The men eat their meagre supper, roll tobacco in scraps of paper, and talk quietly about everything and nothing. Tomorrow will bring more work, more danger, maybe more glory. Tonight they rest, suspended between sea and sky, between crime and freedom. A day in a pirate's life was simple: labour, hunger, laughter, song, and the endless ocean. They lived without comfort, but they lived on their own terms. For men who had once known only obedience, that was treasure enough. Every pirate dreamed of the same moment, the instant when another ship appeared on the horizon and the quiet sea turned into a battlefield. Months of hunger and boredom could vanish in a heartbeat. A dark shape against the sun meant money, meat, rum, and victory, or death. The chase always began with silence. The lookout in the mast called down a single word: sail. Men climbed from their hammocks, still half asleep, and hurried to the rail. The captain raised his spyglass. A merchantman, fat and slow, her decks high and her holds heavy. Perfect prey. Orders followed quickly. The sails were trimmed, the guns loaded, and the crew took their places. Each man knew what to do. Practice made instinct. A pirate ship moved like a living creature when it hunted. The sails adjusted with the wind's smallest change, the wheels shifted by inches. Every creak and whistle of the rigging was language. The helmsman and captain spoke little. They felt the sea through the soles of their feet. They approached from downwind, keeping the sun behind them so the target could not see the black flag until it was too late. Once within a mile, the deck filled with heat and tension. The gunners tested their flints. The surgeon laid out knives and bandages on a clean piece of sailcloth, knowing some of it would soon turn red. The powder monkeys, boys barely 12, carried bags of gunpowder from the magazine, their faces smudged with soot. Even the cook stood ready with buckets of sand to put out fire. Battle was everyone's business. The captain waited until the merchant ship noticed them. A moment of panic swept through the slower vessel. The crew scrambled to arms, the helmsman turned to flee, and the chase began. For hours the two ships raced across the sea, sails straining, men shouting. The pirates threw overboard anything that slowed them. Barrels, planks, spare gear. The faster hull and lighter load gave them the edge. Gradually they closed the gap. At 200 yards, the captain ordered the colours raised. The black flag climbed the mast, skull, hourglass, crossed bones, or sometimes a bleeding heart. Each crew had its own design, painted roughly but filled with meaning. It was not a banner of pride, it was a warning. The flag said, "Surrender now and live." Many did. A merchantman's captain knew that resistance meant slaughter. If he struck his flag, the pirates spared the crew and took the cargo. If he fought, the deck would run red. When the victim refused to yield, the air filled with thunder. The first broadside roared from the pirate ship's guns, iron shot screaming through the sky. Wood splintered, men shouted, smoke rolled thick over the water. Then came the second volley and the third. The pirates aimed not to sink but to cripple. Masts, rudder, sails. Once the enemy slowed, grappling hooks flew across the gap, biting into rail and rigging. The ships locked together like wrestlers. The boarders came next. They climbed the ropes shouting, pistols in one hand and cutlasses in the other. Smoke, sweat, and blood mixed into a single scent. On the merchant deck chaos ruled. Sailors dropping weapons, some praying, some fighting blindly. It ended quickly. Within minutes the surviving crew knelt with their hands behind their heads. The pirates cheered, the wounded groaned, and the smell of powder drifted away on the wind. Victory was followed by discipline. Looting was not a free-for-all. The quartermaster took command and recorded everything. Chests of coin, barrels of rum, bolts of silk, crates of sugar. Each item was marked in a ledger so that every share could later be counted. Jewellery and personal effects were gathered separately. The captain's cabin was searched but not destroyed. Needless waste was forbidden. After the plunder came division. One man's greed could break a crew faster than any cannon. When a ship was valuable enough, they kept it as a prize, renaming it and adding it to their fleet. When it was small or slow, they stripped it bare and let it drift. Sometimes they left the captured crew afloat with provisions. Sometimes they dropped them at the nearest port. Only those who resisted to the end met the rope or the sea. The pirates' reputation for cruelty was earned, but it was also exaggerated by frightened merchants and governments eager for revenge. In truth, terror was their best weapon. A ship that surrendered without a fight was profit without risk. Fear saved ammunition. The captured cargo filled the pirate hold until the deck groaned under its weight. Gold and silver were rare. More often it was cloth, sugar, tobacco, rum, or slaves. Human cargo was the darkest part of their trade. Some pirates freed the chained men they found. Others sold them to the next port for cash. Morality bent easily before survival. Each crew made its own choice, and history seldom recorded it. When the plunder was complete, the victors celebrated. Rum flowed, songs rose, and for a night the sea belonged only to them. But even in revelry they stayed alert. A sudden squall, a hidden reef, a navy ship on the horizon. Any could turn triumph to ruin. The lookout never left his post, and one man always kept a hand on the wheel. Once the adrenaline of battle faded, the real work began. A captured ship was only valuable if it could be turned into money, and money meant trade. Every pirate crew learned the hidden geography of buyers and fences scattered through the Caribbean. Some islands were ruled by men who pretended loyalty to their kings by day and bought stolen goods by night. Others were small coves known only to smugglers, where no questions were asked and the only law was supply and demand. In Nassau the market was open and brazen. Merchants came from every colony to bargain in the sun, bringing food, medicine and gunpowder. They paid with gold coins, livestock and barrels of wine. The exchange looked like any busy port, yet nearly every object there had been taken at gunpoint. The pirates spent their earnings as quickly as they gained them. Some bought better weapons or sails, others squandered everything on rum and women. The town lived on this rhythm of theft and celebration, an economy of risk. The division of spoils followed rules older than most of the men themselves. After the wounded were paid and the ship's maintenance set aside, the remaining wealth was measured and shared. A man who lost a limb received compensation, 600 pieces of 8 for a right arm, 500 for a left, the same for a leg or an eye. Even the simplest sailor could demand fairness, and if the quartermaster tried to cheat, the crew had power to replace him. In this rough equality lay the secret of the pirates' success. They fought not for a crown, but for one another. Trade with the outside world carried danger. A single informer could betray a whole fleet. To protect themselves, pirates built a network of informants, bribed colonial officials, and sometimes made peace with local governors. A bottle of fine rum and a share of gold could make an enemy forget his duty. The borders between outlaw and authority blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. When business was done and their purses heavy, pirates sought pleasure. Taverns lined every waterfront, their doors open from dawn until the candles burned out. Inside was heat, noise, and music, fiddles, drums, laughter, and fights. Rum spilled across the tables, coins changed hands, stories grew larger with each telling. The newly rich boasted about the prizes they had taken, the number of guns on their ship, the number of men they had bested. By morning much of the gold was gone, traded for hangovers and songs. Yet no one regretted it. They had lived hard, and tomorrow was never guaranteed. The art of plunder was not merely theft, it was navigation, timing, and nerve. To succeed, a captain had to read the winds and the minds of men alike. He had to know when to attack, when to flee, when to talk, and when to vanish. A lucky crew might take 10 prizes in a year. A careless one might meet the gallows within a month. The sea judged all equally. Occasionally, fortune smiled brighter than anyone deserved. A single galleon captured in the right waters could yield more wealth than an entire lifetime of labour on land. The Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, taken off Hispaniola in 1683, carried silver so plentiful that the pirates who seized it could not fit it all aboard. They buried part of it on a nearby island, swearing secrecy under the moon. Some of those hoards were never recovered, and tales of buried treasure began. Whether true or not, such stories became the heartbeat of pirate legend, the idea that freedom could be turned into gold and hidden away forever. The myths travelled faster than the ships themselves. In Europe, pamphlets and broadsheets turned rough seamen into romantic villains. Readers in London and Amsterdam thrilled at the adventures of men they would have hanged if they met them. The names of Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts became household words. Governments condemned them while selling the stories that made them famous. But on the water, the reality was simpler. Each sunrise brought choices, whether to chase the sail on the horizon, whether to risk the reefs, whether to trust the man beside you. The coins jingling in a pocket meant food and gunpowder, not luxury. Freedom was expensive, and every day at sea was paid for in sweat and danger. The pirates knew it, and still they chose it. Fear was as valuable as gunpowder. A pirate could win battles without firing a shot if his enemies already believed resistance meant death. Reputation sailed faster than any ship. Word of a cruel captain might reach a port weeks before his arrival, and when his flag appeared on the horizon, the merchant crew's courage collapsed. The best pirates learned this quickly. Terror was currency. Every flag told a story. Some showed skeletons lifting hourglasses to remind victims that time was running out. Others bore hearts dripping blood or swords raised in silent challenge. The sight of black canvas snapping in the wind froze men at their stations. The colour said everything. No quarter given, no mercy asked. Yet the truth beneath the symbol was more complex. Many pirates preferred to take ships intact and crews alive. Dead sailors could not carry cargo ashore or spread tales of their power, so they cultivated an image of savagery while practicing calculation. Before a fight, the crew performed small rituals. Pistols were primed and placed in belts, cutlasses sharpened until they sang against the stone. Some men tied bright ribbons in their hair, or wore scarves dyed crimson to hide blood. A few burned herbs or muttered charms for luck. Superstition was armour against fear. Belief steadied the hand when the first cannon spoke. On many ships, the quartermaster poured a measure of rum on the deck as an offering to the sea. The ocean, after all, decided who lived. When the black flag rose and the drums began, the pirates shouted together. A single roar meant to sound larger than it was. They wanted the enemy to imagine monsters, not men. From afar, the noise and smoke created illusion. From up close, it became chaos. The battle might last minutes or hours, but its memory lingered for years. Survivors carried those memories home and turned them into stories, and those stories multiplied like echoes. The myth of piracy grew from those retellings until it towered over reality. Mercy had its uses. A captain who spared prisoners gained informants, navigators, and goodwill among the frightened merchant class. Sometimes the victors offered captured crews a choice: join us or be set adrift. Many accepted. One day they had sworn to a king. The next they sailed beneath a flag of their own choosing. Every captured man who joined swelled the ranks and spread the legend further. A few pirates, though, embraced cruelty as deliberate strategy. Blackbeard was the master of fear. He tied slow-burning fuses into his beard and hair so that smoke surrounded his face in battle, turning him into a demon in the eyes of his enemies. Others followed his example, painting their faces red or black, wearing coats lined with pistols, decorating themselves with bones or gold. The performance mattered as much as the fight. They understood that reputation was protection. The more terrifying the story, the less often they would need to risk their lives proving it. In the quiet after victory, fear softened into discipline again. Prisoners were questioned for routes and cargo lists, then released or traded. A few unlucky ones were kept as guides. Those spared carried home new stories, that pirates were devils, that the sea belonged to them, that resistance was hopeless. Each tale added another layer of armor around the legend. Governors heard these reports and sent warships. Admirals plotted hunts across entire oceans. Yet for years the pirates eluded them, disappearing into shoals and channels only locals knew. Their reputation became their camouflage. Even a Navy ship hesitated when a dark sail appeared at dusk. Few captains wanted to test whether the rumours were true. The art of plunder was never only about wealth, it was theatre, politics, and survival. A ship was both weapon and stage. The pirates performed for two audiences, the victims before them and the world that would hear of it afterward. Every cannon blast, every act of mercy or cruelty was part of the same play, a story told to keep enemies afraid and friends loyal. And while that story endured, their power endured with it. By the second decade of the 18th century, the world had learned their names. Pamphlets in London warned merchants to avoid certain waters. Taverns in Boston and Bristol sang songs about battles no sailor present had ever seen. To some they were criminals, to others heroes. But beneath the noise the tide was changing. Empires had grown tired of humiliation. Trade was the blood of their power, and piracy was bleeding it away. Britain, France, and Spain began to cooperate, an alliance impossible on land but necessary at sea. Governors received orders to crush the pirate republics once and for all. Amnesty was offered first, royal pardons for those who surrendered within a year. Many captains accepted, tired of running. Benjamin Hornigold laid down his arms and became a hunter of his former comrades. Others laughed at the offer, raised fresh sails and vowed never to kneel. For a while the game continued. Pirate fleets scattered across the Atlantic, slipping into Africa, the Indian Ocean, even the South China Sea. They raided slave ships off Sierra Leone and treasure convoys near Madagascar. The world's oceans became one connected highway of rebellion. But the net was closing. New warships were faster, crews better trained, their captains rewarded by the promise of prize money and glory. Slowly, one by one, the outlaws vanished. The end rarely came with glory. Some ships were caught in storms, their stories swallowed whole. Others were cornered in shallow bays, their decks riddled with musket fire until silence fell. Survivors were dragged to colonial ports to stand trial before judges who already knew the sentence. Gallows were built beside the harbours, the nooses swaying in the salt wind. The condemned were hanged in chains so that every sailor entering port would see what freedom cost. Yet even as the black flags came down, the idea they carried refused to die. In every port a few men still whispered of Nassau, of equal shares, of captains chosen by vote. To them it was not crime but a glimpse of a better order, brief and imperfect, but real. Long after the last pirate swung from the yard arm, the dream of freedom on the open sea continued to haunt the imagination. The art of plunder had ended, but the art of myth had just begun. Writers turned them into legends, painters gave them faces fiercer than truth, and generations of readers turned their cruelty into adventure. Children played at being pirates, waving wooden swords without understanding the hunger, fear, and courage behind the word. What had once been desperation became romance. The sea kept its secrets, and the world remembered only the stories. When the sun sets over a calm horizon, and the sails of a distant ship catch fire in the light, it is easy to believe that somewhere a black flag still flies, hidden by time but not forgotten. The men who raised it were outlaws, but they were also dreamers. They believed, for a handful of years, that the ocean could belong to anyone brave enough to claim it. In their defiance, they left behind more than treasure. They left the idea that freedom, however brief, is worth any price. When the world's empires were still learning how to rule, the pirates of the Caribbean built a small, fleeting republic of their own. It had no borders, no king, and no written law beyond the will of its people. Yet for a few shining years it worked. A floating democracy born out of hunger, courage, and rebellion. The heart of that experiment was Nassau. From a distance the island looked unremarkable, a curve of sand, some palms, a few hills. But to the sailors of the early 18th century it was paradise. The harbour was deep enough to shelter dozens of ships. The reefs kept the Navy's heavy warships away, and the nearby settlements were too poor and too distant for any governor to care. Nassau belonged to those who could hold it. They came from everywhere. Englishmen, Scots, Irish, Africans, Frenchmen, escaped slaves, deserters and wanderers, all drawn by the promise of freedom. Ships limped into the harbour with patched sails and bullet-scarred hulls, carrying crews who had grown tired of serving kings. There was no ceremony, no oath of allegiance, only a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. They called it simply the Republic. The town was a strange place, half ruins and half revelry. Abandoned forts overlooked taverns made of driftwood. Sails served as roofs, barrels as tables. At night fires burned along the beach and music drifted across the water. The smell of roasting meat mixed with salt and smoke. Men gambled, sang and shouted in every tongue known to the Atlantic. There were no taxes, no magistrates, and few rules. Yet somehow life continued in a rough kind of order. Each ship was a small republic within the larger one. When a new crew arrived, the men gathered on the sand to draw up articles, agreements that bound them together. They swore to share profits fairly, to vote on major decisions, to care for the wounded, and to replace any captain who betrayed their trust. It was simple, direct, and more just than most governments on land. The rules were copied, altered, and passed from ship to ship till they became tradition. The captains of this strange democracy were not tyrants but servants of their men. They led in battle but ruled only by consent. If they abused power, the crew could depose them with a vote. The quartermaster balanced their authority, keeping the keys to the hold, and the power to distribute shares. No aristocrat could have imagined such a system. No monarch would have tolerated it. But for the men who had spent their lives under the lash, it was liberation. For a brief moment, Nassau flourished. Merchants came secretly to trade, bringing flour, salt pork, medicine, and gunpowder in exchange for stolen goods. Ships anchored by the dozen, their masts rising like a forest above the bay. There were no customs officers, no naval patrols, no sermons, just the wind, the sea, and the knowledge that for the first time they owned their labour. Men who had been slaves of empire now stood as equals. Among them walked women too. Anne Bonny and Mary Red among the most famous, who fought, sailed, and drank beside their comrades as freely as any man. This fragile order could not last forever. Prosperity drew attention. By 1717, the British Crown decided to reclaim its lost colony. A royal governor, Woodes Rogers, was appointed to bring Nassau back under control. Rogers had once been a privateer himself and understood the minds of his enemies. He arrived with warships, soldiers, and an offer: amnesty for those who surrendered peacefully, death for those who resisted. Many pirates accepted the pardon. They were weary of hunger and pursuit, tired of watching the gallows rise in every port. They came ashore, laid down their weapons, and took new oaths under the Union Jack. Rogers welcomed them, hoping to turn enemies into citizens. For a while it seemed to work, but others refused. Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, and their followers slipped away under cover of darkness, vowing to keep the Republic alive somewhere beyond the horizon. Vane was the embodiment of defiance. Reckless and proud, he refused every offer of forgiveness. When the new governor's ships entered Nassau's harbour, Vane lit his own vessel on fire and steered it toward them, the flames painting the night sky red. While the enemy panicked, his crew escaped through the smoke. It was a gesture of pure rebellion, a final salute to the freedom they were about to lose. Outside Nassau, scattered groups of pirates tried to rebuild their world. They found refuge in hidden coves, among sympathetic islanders, or along the Carolina coast. For a few more years the old flag flew, though fewer ships answered its call. Each victory felt smaller, each loss heavier. The sea that had once sheltered them now betrayed them with calm indifference. The world of commerce was growing stronger, and there was no place left for men without masters. Within Nassau itself, the transformation was swift. Rogers built fortifications, restored the town, and reopened the churches. He hanged the most notorious captains and displayed their bodies in iron cages along the shore. The people who had once cheered the pirates now whispered prayers for mercy. The beach that had been a place of songs and laughter became a place of silence and warning. By 1720 the Republic of Pirates was gone, yet even as the structures of power returned, the memory of that experiment lingered. Sailors who had lived under the black flag carried its spirit wherever they went. In taverns from Boston to Bristol, they told stories of a time when poor men ruled themselves, when decisions were made by vote, when every man's voice mattered. The world heard these tales and called them fantasy. But beneath the exaggeration lay something true, a glimpse of equality in an age of chains. The Republic's fall was not failure but transformation. It proved that ordinary men, when given the chance, could govern their own lives without kings or masters. Their laws were crude, their justice rough, but their dream was pure. They sought not wealth alone, but dignity, the right to decide how to live and die. History would bury them beneath accusations of crime, yet their brief democracy at sea would outlast the empires that destroyed it. Centuries later, when sailors raised unions and workers demanded fair wages, they echoed unknowingly the old pirate articles of Nassau. Equal shares, vote by crew, care for the wounded. These ideas, born on a wind-tossed island, would find new life on land. The pirates had no philosophers, no treatises or manifestos, only the shared knowledge of suffering. And from that knowledge they built a republic. When the last of them vanished, the sea remained unchanged, blue, endless, indifferent. But somewhere, deep beneath its surface, their laughter still seemed to echo. The world would remember their crimes and forget their courage, but the truth stayed hidden in the salt air. For a brief time in history, freedom had found a home on the waves. It's everything. Long after ships have rotted and names have faded, the ocean still carries the echoes of those who lived and died upon it. In the early 1720s, those echoes belonged to the last of the pirates. Their flag still flew, but the wind that once filled this was dying. The world had changed. Trade routes had multiplied, ports had grown stronger, and the great powers of Europe had learned to work together when profit demanded it. The law of kings now reached farther than ever before. The age of the free sailor was closing, and the sea that had given them life began to turn against them. Merchants demanded security. Governors wrote letters filled with anger and fear. The crown responded with iron. Squadrons of warships were sent to the Caribbean, the American coast, and the coast of Africa. Each captain carried orders to give no quarter. Where once the pirates had chased merchantmen, now the navy hunted them in return. Reckless. Charles Vane's luck ran out in 1720. Caught in a storm and betrayed by his own crew, he was taken to Jamaica in chains. He stood before the court unrepentant, defiant to the last. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentence, he smiled and said only that a short life and a merry one were better than years spent in slavery. Days later his body hung from the gallows, and the black flag sank a little lower. Followed soon after. His ship was trapped near Jamaica by the navy, his crew drunk and unprepared. Among the prisoners were Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who fought fiercely before capture. When the men were hanged, the two women claimed to be pregnant and won a stay of execution. Mary died in prison. Anne vanished into rumour. Some said she escaped and lived quietly under another name, the only pirate to cheat the gallows completely. In every colonial port, gallows were raised beside the docks, a forest of warning. Executed pirates were left hanging in iron cages as reminders to those who still dreamed of freedom. Their bodies swung for months in the sun until the bones fell into the tide. The message was clear. The age of rebellion was over. The pirates refused to disappear quietly. The most feared among them was Edward Teach, Blackbeard. He ruled the Carolina coast like a storm, his beard plaited and tied with burning fuses so that smoke wreathed his face. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a floating fortress. He blockaded harbours, seized merchantmen, and charmed governors with bribes and laughter. For years he evaded every attempt to capture him. In 1818, his fortune ended. The governor of Virginia sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard with 2 small sloops to hunt him down. They met near Ocracoke Island, where the waters were shallow and treacherous. The battle began before dawn. Smoke, fire, and musket shot filled the air. Teach fought like a man possessed, his pistols firing until the barrels were hot. When it was over, he had been wounded more than 20 times. His head was severed and hung from Maynard's bowsprit, carried back to the mainland as proof that the terror of the Atlantic was gone. The sea fell silent. Legend. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, perhaps the most successful of them all, captured more than 400 ships before the end came. He died in battle off the coast of Africa in 1722, shot through the throat by a cannonball. His crew threw his body into the sea as he had commanded, so that no man could hang him. With his death, the last great pirate fleet dissolved, scattering like foam before the wind. The black flags had vanished from the horizon. Some survivors accepted pardons and became fishermen or merchants. Others vanished into the islands, changing their names and leaving the past behind. A few, unwilling to surrender, tried their luck in far seas, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea. But even there the empires followed. The dream of a world without masters sank beneath the weight of order. As ever carried on. Storms rose and faded, whales passed beneath the waves, and the bones of ships settled slowly into sand. But the memory of the pirates did not drown. Sailors still told stories of them in whispers, the courage, the laughter, the cruelty, the gold buried where no man would find it. Each tale softened the edges, turning killers into heroes and thieves into adventurers. The truth became mist, shaped by wind and longing. Even the governments that had hunted them found use for their image. Writers filled pamphlets with their exploits. Moralists turned them into cautionary tales, and later generations transformed them into romantic figures of freedom. The same world that had hanged them now sold their stories in the streets. Their real lives, hard, hungry, fleeting, were forgotten. What remained was the symbol, the black flag, flying forever in imagination. It was not only the end of an era, it was the end of a possibility. For a brief moment, the poorest men on earth had ruled themselves. They had lived without kings or masters, shared what they earned, and written their own laws. They had tasted freedom so complete that it frightened the world. And because it frightened the world destroyed it. Still, the idea lingered like salt on the tongue. It whispered in every story of rebellion, in every song about the open sea. The pirates had proved that equality was not a dream invented by philosophers. It was something men could live, even if only for a heartbeat in history. Their ships are gone, their treasures lost, but their defiance remains. A small, steady light on the horizon, impossible to extinguish. Life took them back in the end. Yet on quiet nights, when the wind blows from the east and the stars hang low over the water, it's easy to imagine that somewhere, Beyond the reach of empire, a lonely ship still drifts with tattered sails and faded flag. The crew sleeps in their hammocks, dreaming not of gold but of freedom, the same freedom that once made the whole world tremble. And the ocean, patient and eternal, keeps their secret. It knows that every tide brings change, that every age ends, but that the hunger for liberty never disappears. The black flag may have fallen, but the idea it carried still sails on, unseen, unstoppable, and free.